definition of environmental racism, just as a recap from the homework from last night, is policies and practices that discriminate people of color by forcing them to live near polluted areas. And a quote that supports this is "Racism trumps class. Even middle-income African Americans are more likely to live in polluted neighborhoods," by Dr. Richard Willard, who is a member of environmental justice at the University of Texas. And one study shows that Blacks earning $50,000 to $60,000 a year are more likely to face environmental racism over whites that earn only $10,000 a year. And these are some general statistics about environmental racism. People who live below the poverty line are 35% more likely to face environmental racism. And for Blacks, it is 54%, and for non-whites, it is 28%. I didn't do that much research on whites facing environmental racism, but I know the numbers are much lower. And this results in a lot more health issues. So that relates to healthcare, and I'll get into that later. And a lot of children are missing school because they're feeling sick, and that results in the children getting less of an education, and that ends up fueling the poverty cycle. So eminent domain is when the government takes away property, so your property, for private use. And this relates to the Fifth Amendment, which says, "No private property shall be taken for public use without just compensation." So there are two parts, the public use and without just compensation. So when the government wants to take your house away, they can only use it for public use, such as a park, because the park is something that everyone can share and use. But the government can't take away your house and then live in your house, because that's not something that everyone can do. So one case that was about eminent domain is Berman versus Parker. So this is when a department store owner, the government wanted to take away his department store and put in this agency that would help the gentrification of that neighborhood. And he argued the Fifth Amendment, saying that it was not for public use because it was a private agency and only some people would benefit from it. But the government said that it was for public purpose because the agency would better the neighborhood, and they thought that the neighborhood were like slums, and they thought that it could be better. And ultimately, in the end, the government won. So that's like an example of eminent domain, in the abuse of that power. So one case of environmental racism is Cancer Alley, and to first give you a background, I'm going to give you some demographics. Louisiana is the third poorest state in the United States, and 20% of its population live under the poverty line, and for Baton Rouge, it is 25% living under the poverty line. And for single women and children under 5, it is 50% who live under the poverty line. And also, 80% of Louisiana's population is Black. And here is this table of number of people in your household, and this is the poverty line. Alright, so this is Cancer Alley. This is an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River, and every single dot is a petrochemical facility, and there are over 200 along this river. About 80% of Louisiana's entire population lives within 3 miles of this river. So is that really a coincidence? Because residents have a lot higher chance of contracting cancer. Studies have shown that in 2013, there were 334 incidents where the workers made mistakes, and therefore these chemicals were being released into the air. There are billions of pounds of chemicals, and that's why people are contracting cancer. And the problem is that these facilities are backed up by the government because they're paying all these taxes to support the government, and in return, the government doesn't back up the residents. And here are some clips about the impacts of environmental racism.
This is the petrochemical corridor, an 85-mile stretch of land along the Mississippi River that is home to more than 150 industrial plants that produce stuff like rubber, asphalt, and refined oil. But the people who live here have another name for it.
The chemical corridor, commonly known as Cancer Alley.
In this part of Louisiana, cancer is seen to touch everyone's lives.
I have 100 people in the meeting. Has anybody in the room had anybody in their house die of cancer? Everybody stand up.
Someone just passed away 3 houses down from cancer.
Because I had one friend, I went and visit her on 4th Street on a Friday. And then Monday morning I got up, I said, I'm gonna go see Mary Alice. I got a call, she was dead. She died of cancer. She had 3 other sisters, she had 2 brothers that died with cancer.
I'm trying to think who I know that died, that did die from cancer, since I moved back here.
Now this, visited towns along the Mississippi River with Senator Cory Booker, who is proposing legislation regarding environmental justice.
In Louisiana, we have a minimum standoff, which is like 500 feet between a plant, an oil well, and your front door. That's how close they can be.
Martha Huckabee and Betty Pickle live in one such fence-line community in St. Rose, just blocks over from a 1,000-acre international Matex tank terminal plant.
And they're right here. There's no buffer. There needs to be a buffer. They should be miles away, you know?
But this is just too close to somebody's yard.
Unfortunately, this is where our house is. So in a sense, you are trapped because you can't pick your house up and move it somewhere else.
They say they both felt the effects of a 10-day-long hydrogen sulfide release from a Shell asphalt plant in 2014.
I believe the people. I would not believe the government data. The CDC is a bunch of shit.
People shared their experiences living in the area with Senator Booker at a local town hall. They talked about cancer, asthma, even their face burning from just stepping outside.
3 months ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. Women tell me that they have miscarriages, stillbirths, problems with their skin, rashes, vomiting, lots of cancer, respiratory problems, asthma increases in children here, adult onset of asthma increases here. So there's not just cancer, there's a lot of quality of life issues that affects the communities.
Residents of
Okay, so those were some videos, and what they were talking about with the buffer is that the house is right here, and then the chemical facilities have this buffer of only about 500 feet. So if they were closer to 500 feet, then that's legal, but then after 500 feet, it's okay. But to give you a sense of how far 500 feet is, only 1.5 blocks away, so that's actually really, really, really close. Yeah.
Buffer is just like a space between.
Yeah, yeah. So as you can see, like there are a lot of major impacts, like health issues, and as you can see, like the cemetery sites. And then what they're talking about later, they were in this like meeting in this building. That's basically them. They always hold these like conferences to talk about environmental racism, and they try to strategize ways into overcoming this. Okay, so now after watching this video, do you have any ideas on how to tackle environmental racism? So I know there's only like a few of us, so I was planning on like a little discussion, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was talking to my sister about this, and one of the things that we were talking about was that most of these communities along the Mississippi River that kind of rely on these factories and industrial plants, I would say, they kind of rely on them for jobs. And I feel like one of the solutions being proposed is like just completely getting rid of them, but then you're going to leave these communities without jobs, which is going to just reinforce the cycle of poverty. So I feel like if we have to find a common ground between keeping these industries there to provide jobs, but also kind of take the community's concerns into consideration.
Yeah, and also like the government seems to not really mind that these facilities are here because again, like those facilities are like paying billions of dollars in taxes to support the government.
One of the state government relies heavily on them. I don't know about the federal government because
I don't think the federal government, but yeah, the local.
Because the federal government pays like half the budget for all these state governments, like Louisiana and Mississippi and that stuff.
But I mean, there's a lobbying action going on, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so there's the whole issue around. I mean, it's interesting, right? The whole issue around regulations to clean up factories, which then bump into people saying, well, but that's too expensive, so that's the negative that's a negative impact on our bottom line, which I'm sure is true on some level. I mean, I'm sure there's some impact, right? There is some cost to having clean chemistry. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think Louisiana is a particularly interesting example because there are a lot of confounding variables that are happening. Most of the people are living on that corridor because they need work, because most of the state is a floodplain, right? So people are living sort of higher grounds, closer to the river, closer to the levee, because that's where the work is. Therefore, you're going to find that's where the cancer is going to be, because that's where the people are.
Yeah,
and which is also where so the question is like, and again, this is not to put in doubt their stories. I'm totally willing to believe that petrochemical companies cause cancer. Like I have no problem with that. But it's an interesting case where it's really hard to prove. It's really hard to prove the causality between the cancer and the petrochemical because everybody lives there. It's not like most, it's like over 80% of the population lives on that corridor. So of course that's where the cancer is going to be.
Yeah, but couldn't you just compare it to a different town that isn't near a different state with the town? You
can. I used to live in Massachusetts, and there was a town called Salem, Massachusetts, famous for its witch hunts in the 18th century, but also famous for a power plant. That was it was a coal power plant in Salem. There was a movie made. Erin Brockovich, right? Oh. So she was an activist who tried to fight against and the problem is always how do you establish the problem is that all the laws that are in the book assume that you can pinpoint a source for the disease, whatever disease is, right? And in this particular case, there was the whole, there was one coal power plant and everybody was getting sick around it. And even then, it was really hard. Even then, it was really hard to attribute exact cause to that power plant. So imagine in a case where, everybody's sick, but everybody has to live around the river. It just, as much as I sympathize, it's incredibly hard to litigate and to bring to court.
And it's kind of even harder when half the people don't even want to file a lawsuit because then they're gonna know they're gonna lose their jobs if they do so.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a decision a lot of them have to make.
Yeah.
I mean, even outside of their jobs, people can be displaced from their homes if they're like, oh, this is wrong, especially in Bayview, Hunters Point area, just with the test bombing sites and all the radioactive waste still kind of lingering there. There's not a whole lot that they can do, and actually recently, I believe the city has been saying, or I don't know who controls that, but they've been saying oh yeah, we're cleaning it up. And, just recently they found that it's still very hazardous for the residents and stuff.
Yeah, so the thing is, there's a lot of corruption in this because I was gonna present about that topic too, but I didn't have time. But when SF was testing for the soil samples, they actually took the soil from over there to pass the test. So it's really messed up. Yeah. And then now they're trying to make it a housing area so people are living on the soil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The video made reference to Cory Booker and some legislation. Do you know anything about that?
I think they're trying to get a lot of action to pass these laws to help these like health issues, but a lot of times the government is just ignoring them, such as like the Flint water crisis. A lot of times, or like 1,700 lawsuits were filed against Flint for the hazardous water, and the EPA just ignored everything because they're like, oh no, like the water is actually really clean and you don't know what you're talking about, even though thousands of people are getting sick.
But Senator Cory Booker is not from Louisiana, right?
Oh yeah,
He's from
sorry,
New
that was
Jersey.
just an example, but I think that the government is just like ignoring what these citizens are saying. And there are a lot of like organizations to try and tackle this idea, or try and tackle this issue. And the last final thing that I want you guys to do is play this game called Spent. I don't know if you guys have played it before, but you can just search on your laptop like Spent game, and it's basically like I tried to find like a game that related to like racism and poverty, but for this one, this kind of mainly only relates to poverty, but you can take into account race, like just imagine it, and it also talks about healthcare, and you have to choose a healthcare plan, which relates to this Louisiana case, and it's really fun. You have to survive 30 days.
Oh, damn.
And you're only given $1,000 and you have to make all these decisions. So, good luck. So, you can do this. It's actually not.
Even in their movies and stuff.
Yeah, kind of like the stuff that we take for granted is kind of stuff they can barely afford. It's like living conditions, food, clothes, and like after school activities and that stuff. But the main thing I feel like the main reason I feel like poverty reinforces environmental racism is because of the healthcare factor, because of the fact that a lot of these communities live in very polluted areas. They're more susceptible to kind of health problems and issues, and if they don't have money to pay for those health issues, the ultimate concern is death, but they can also they can't get sick leave and that stuff, so they have to work through it, which could have like very negative effects in the long run.
Yeah, one major factor that contributes to this is the lack of political power they have because they're living in poverty, so the government is less likely to listen to them because they don't really have that many resources. And any last comments? Alright, thank you.